didn't see you there. I'm Karnick, veteran film director, Cold War historian, and high school student. I was just reading about the Cold War and all the fear and hardship that it caused, and I thought, you know what? Youngsters these days don't know enough about the post-war history and the Cold War, so I've decided to take you on a magical and fun-educational journey through the end of World War II up until this very day. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and maybe you'll learn something along the way. Well, let's get started. Now, let's start off by setting the stage for this period in time. Behind me, you can see a map showing Europe immediately following the end of World War II. Right over here should be Russia and Eastern Europe, which were left in ruins following the war. And over here should be Germany, which recently lost the war and was under control of the Allies. I know what you're wondering. How did the winning countries decide how to split up Europe? Well, I'll tell you. You see, the three most powerful Western leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, met in a meeting called the Yalta Conference, where they decided to split the world up along these lines. As you can see on the map, these countries were put under control of the Soviet Union and became communist, while these countries stayed outside of Soviet control and stayed capitalist. As you can see, Germany is actually divided in two, making the countries of West Germany and East Germany. This was the beginning of what became known as the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union created a wall of countries along their borders, which they used as buffers to protect from future attacks. By doing this, they divided Europe into distinct east and west halves. The division severed all relations between the halves and formed what we call the Iron Curtain. Now, you've probably got some questions. Mainly, what caused the tensions between communists and capitalists? Well, I've outlined it on this chart over here. You see, the main goals of the U.S. were mainly A. Spread capitalism to other European countries to increase their influence. B. Unify Germany to stabilize it and prevent it from waging war again. And 3. Focus on their own expansion and stay out of Europe's business. As for the USSR, their goals involved A. Spreading communism across the world as part of a worldwide workers' rebellion. B. Keep Germany divided to avoid it from having too strong of an economy or military and allowing it to wage war again. And 3. Rebuild the countries that had been destroyed by the war. So, you can see where the conflicting interests would cause a rivalry to form. Now, don't worry kids, there's more content still. We're just getting started. Okay, let's move on to the U.S. and their shenanigans regarding communism. You see, the U.S. had a policy called containment, which involved blocking Soviet expansion and aiding smaller countries in resisting communism. A number of powerful figures created plans to further the goal. President Harry Truman devised the Truman Doctrine, which called for supporting small countries who wish to resist communism. And Secretary of State George Marshall came up with the Marshall Plan, which involved giving aid to capitalist nations in Europe to help them rebuild. During this time, we finally began what is known as the Cold War. Both superpowers formed alliances. The U.S. joined the United Nations and NATO, while the Soviet Union created an alliance called the Warsaw Pact. However, these alliances created a much more sinister threat. Both world superpowers own nuclear weapons and were almost at the point of using them. This state of affairs became known as brinkmanship because the world was always on the brink of nuclear war. This competition soon led to the space race, where the US and USSR competed to develop better aerospace technology. But wait just 1 minute. We didn't think that the US and Soviet Union were the only countries in turmoil. Oh no, follow me and I'll tell you about another one, China. The main difference between tension in Europe compared to China is that China was fighting within itself. A civil war was occurring there in the late 40s between the US-supported nationalists, led by Jiang Jiechi, and the Soviet-supported communists, led by Mao Zedong. Unfortunately, the communists eventually drove out the nationalists and established a totally socialist government. Under Mao, China expanded its borders into India and Tibet and rebuilt itself on the inside. Zedong was a devout follower of Marxist socialism and created communal farms, which soon collapsed. Also, Mao led a large following called the Red Guards, whose goal it was to promote simple labor and end education. They went on a reign of terror, shutting down schools and killing a number of intellectuals. Eventually, even Mao had to call for them to stop. However, China stayed under communism and still is today. Now, we move on to a more exciting part of the conflict, all-out war. Remember the U.S.'s policy of containment? Well, that came into effect in the early 50s, when North Korea moved to invade South Korea. The U.S. attempted to defend and support South Korea, and sent over a joint force with Britain, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Despite a number of decisive victories, MacArthur's forces were eventually driven back into the south. However, they eventually drove back the communist North Koreans and Chinese as well. Eventually, the U.S. forces also re-established the previous border that North Korea had pushed back over. They also created a mile-long demilitarized zone between the two nations, which still remains to this day. But we aren't done with the war yet. Not too far away from Korea, another Asian country is also facing civil war. This country was Vietnam. During the early 20th century, Vietnam was under French colonial control, but, like many other colonies, it eventually revolted. A young revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh turned to the communists for help and drove out the French in the 1930s. The French and Vietnamese would continue to fight up until the mid-40s, but eventually the communists took full control of North Vietnam. In response to this, the U.S. once again enacted their policy of containment. They saw Asia as a series of dominoes. After one fell to communism, others were sure to follow. The U.S. helped the French set up an anti-communist government in South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Unfortunately, Diem was a harsh and corrupt ruler and attracted much opposition. Eventually, the communist guerrilla fighters called Viet Cong killed him and began an all-out civil war. The U.S. then decided that they needed to get involved. President Lyndon B. Johnson got authorization to send in troops to Vietnam in 1964, and our involvement began. By 1968, almost 500,000 U.S. troops were at war. But all was not well. Despite being the best trained military in the world, the U.S. Army was ill-equipped to fight in the jungle environment of Vietnam, and often fell prey to Viet Cong ambush tactics and man traps. Because of this, the U.S. Army began to rely more heavily on airstrikes and bombing runs to combat the Viet Cong forces. In addition to poor performance in terms of combat, U.S. involvement in Vietnam became increasingly unpopular with Americans. For this reason, President Richard Nixon began a plan called Vietnamization. Its goal was to slowly pull out U.S. troops of Vietnam and turn over control to Allied South Vietnamese troops. Eventually, U.S. troops left Vietnam entirely in 1973. By 1975, the Viet Cong had won, and the country was entirely under communist control, and still is today. In North Korea and Vietnam, most of the world was divided by the Cold War. It was caught in the struggle between the USSR and America. Both superpowers wanted to control the uncivilized world in most developing countries. To help you understand, allow me to demonstrate using these rocks. You see, this large rock represents the world, while these two smaller rocks represent the US and USSR. You see, on the world stage, the two rocks compete and spread their influence over all the other countries. This is much like what happened during the Cold War. The two superpowers use a number of elements to their advantage, such as foreign aid, propaganda, multinational alliances, brinkmanship, surrogate wars, espionage, and John Rambo. Essentially, the planet was divided into three worlds. The first world, capitalist nations; the second world, communist nations; and the third world, poor and developing nations. One of the most important third world conflicts occurred in Cuba in the late 1950s. In the late 50s, Fidel Castro took control and communized the country. Soon, Cuba joined forces with the Soviet Union. After U.S. surveillance detected Soviet missile bases in Cuba, we began a standoff known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a few weeks, the world was right on the brink of nuclear war. In addition to the Civil War in Nicaragua, the U.S. also played a part in a number of Middle Eastern conflicts. In Iran, for example, the U.S. tried to support a secular government, but was eventually driven out by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who created a theocracy in that country. Also, the Soviet Union backed an uprising in Afghanistan and supported the Taliban in ruling the country. To this day, the U.S. is still working to suppress the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, we come to a much more calming period in the Cold War. Slow lessening of tension between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Starting in 1953, when Nikita Khrushchev took power, the Soviet Union began to remove the traces of Stalin's fascist regime and called for peaceful competition with the capitalists. Also, many of Russia's territories in Eastern Europe called for an end to communism. These protests were strong, but were forcefully ended by Russian military force. As for Cuba, they held firmly to communism, had a number of disagreements with the Soviets, and eventually broke their alliance with them. The U.S. also began moving towards better relations with the communist world. Beginning with Nixon in the early 70s, the U.S. began using a policy called detente. This meant slowly easing relations with enemy countries. He practiced this policy by visiting China peacefully in 1972, and visiting the Soviet Union a few months later. Nixon also began to disarm the conflict by signing the SALT Treaty, that stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, which limited the number of nuclear weapons that each country could own. Unfortunately, the policy of detente began to break down following the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. He had a firmly anti-communist stance and refused to negotiate with the Soviet Union. He also increased tension by spending more money on defenses and enacting the Strategic Defense Initiative Bill to protect from Soviet missiles. For a while, it looked like we might have a nuclear war on our hands. But, as you know, that never happened. The Cold War eventually ended sometime afterwards. The Berlin Wall was torn down in the mid-80s, once again uniting Europe. Many other countries still remain communist, but the U.S. is slowly trying to suppress their influence, and relations with the Soviet Union are now relatively normal. We're still somewhat suspicious of one another, but are no longer on the brink of nuclear war. But I know what you're wondering. Bobby, has anything good come of the Cold War? Well, I think so. Many great media products have been inspired by the Cold War and sub-conflicts. Without it, we wouldn't have great movies like Rambo, Dr. Strangelove, Forrest Gump, FMJ, or any other kind of Vietnam movies. And great games like the incredible Call of Duty Black Ops. But I think there's something much more we can take away from this. If the Cold War taught me anything, it's that sometimes you just have to calm down and stop the fighting. If we hadn't ended the conflict with the Soviet Union, we could have had a nuclear war by now. I think both superpowers learned that the things they were fighting about were a lot less important than the possible consequences. Well, that's all for now. I hope you kids learned something important today. Until next time, I'm Bobby Karnick. You stay classy, Dunwoody High School.